Matthew chapter number 14. John the Baptist, who is Jesus' cousin, has just been beheaded. And so Jesus gets in this boat, and the Bible says that he goes out to a solitary place, more than likely to mourn, to grieve a little bit, because he was Jesus, but this was still his cousin. So he goes out to a solitary place. Once Jesus gets back to the shore, though, it says that a crowd gathered at the shore. Verse number 14 says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. One thing I need us to see to start out today is that if we are going to live lives of Jesus, if we are going to live like Jesus, then it requires us to have compassion. If we're going to be like Jesus, it requires us to have compassion on those who are hurting, have compassion on those who are broken, have compassion on those who have lost hope. It requires us to do this because Jesus saw them and he had compassion. I think a lot of times we can get so wrapped up in our own worlds and so wrapped up in everything going on in our lives that we forget to have compassion. We get so wrapped up in everything that we're stressed out with that we forget to have compassion. It says in verse 15, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. And Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Can you imagine the disciples' faces here? They're like, Jesus, these people are hungry. And listen, we all know when people get to a certain level of hungry, then they step over into hangry. And the disciples are the ones that are going to have to handle the hangry people, not Jesus. So Jesus says, no, they don't need to go anywhere. You feed them. And they're like, what? What? Because they knew that they didn't have what it took. Like, they're like, I'm no mathematician, but the ratios don't add up. 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, thousands of people. Like, Jesus, I know you've been in mourning, you're grieving, maybe you're not thinking straight. Let's talk through this. But Jesus says in verse 18, bring them here to me, he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up at heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up the 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Isn't this something? The disciples are all stressed out. They're no different than any of us. They're stressed out trying to find a solution to a problem. They're all stressed out trying to figure out how they can feed all of these people. And they look at Jesus and they're saying, Jesus, we got to find some food. And Jesus says, it's simple, really. The answer is simple, really. You give them something to eat. Like, the answer is right here. The answer is setting in your hands. And now naturally the disciples did what any of us would have done. They look at each other, then they look at the food, and they look at each other and they look at the food and they're like, what? What? Why were they all stressed out? Because they knew that what they had was not enough. You ever looked at yourself and felt like what you had to offer was not enough? You ever gone into a marriage that you were so excited to get into, and then you got into it and you're like, I don't know if I have what it takes to do what I got to do in this marriage. I'll be honest for myself. A lot of times I feel like I'm not enough. A lot of times I feel that way. When I got married, so excited, then get into marriage, it's like, oh my gosh, I hope that I'm enough. Because I know I hit the lottery, jackpot, everything. I hope I'm enough to keep her. You know what I'm saying? But then like our first son came, and I'm just having anxiety, stress about, man, am I going to be enough of a great dad? Am I going to be enough of a father? Then we have a second child, and it's like, am I going to be enough? Sometimes, honestly, I don't feel like I'm enough to be a pastor. Sometimes it's like, maybe I need some more preparation. Maybe I need some more time. Maybe I need some more training. because sometimes I can feel like I'm not enough to be a pastor, and I'm just being vulnerable and honest with you because I need you to be vulnerable and honest with God today. Not with me, but with God, because a lot of us, the reason that we're so frustrated and stressed out and nervous and anxious is it boils down to the fact we don't feel like we are enough. Jesus tells us this is something you're to do. Dustin, you're called to ministry, to pastor. And he tells us you got what it takes, but it's like, I don't think that it's enough. Is it gonna be enough? You ever looked at your bank account and wondered if it was enough to get you to the end of the month? You ever looked at your gas light in your car and wondered if it's enough to get you to the gas station? The disciples looked at what they had in their hands, in the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they're like, Jesus, this is not enough. This is not enough. We do not have enough in our hands to do this. And they said, Jesus, you send them away to go get some food. He told them, they told Jesus, they said, Jesus, you need to send them away. And we tend to do this a lot of times. We see somebody who is in need, but we feel like it's their responsibility to fix it. Because after all, don't we all have our own problems? Don't we all have our own issues? Don't we all have our own things that we're going through? So we'll see somebody that is in need, and Jesus will tell us to be there and meet it for them. But we're like, I got so much going on. Jesus, send them away to get some help. And Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, no. He says, the answer is in your hands. You have the answer. And the disciples, they look down at what Jesus says that they have, that's the answer, and they're like, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? Jesus will tell us sometimes, I've given you the answer, and you're looking at the answer, and it's like, what am I looking at? So this morning, I want to talk to you on the subject, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? Let's pray together. God, I thank you for today, and I just thank you for all that you've done here at Rosebud Road. Lord, as we step into the next chapter that you have for us, may we not forget the miracles that have taken place. May we not forget the foundation that has been laid. May we not forget all the things that you have done and all the times that you've shown up. Lord, as we close out today with one final Sunday, I pray that you would help it to be the best Sunday we have ever had as a church. I pray that you would help us to all have hearts to hear from you today, to be open and receptive to you. Lord, may we be vulnerable with you. Not worry about our neighbor, not worry about who's sitting next to us, but God, it's between us and you today. And may we take what is spoken by you and apply it to our lives. I pray that you would help us not to see and to hear from me, but to see and to hear from you. And I thank you for it today in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Now, have you ever had this happen to you? Have you ever had somebody who was trying to show you something and you looked at it and you can't figure out what they're trying to show you? Like, it doesn't make sense. You don't understand what they're trying to show you. Anybody that's ever happened? Like, I know we have a lady in the church named Mary who will send out letters sometimes and put together, like, in the connect cards and all these kind of things. And she's like, I need the gift of interpretation because I can't read what's written on this paper. Like, what am I looking at? Like, what name is this? Is this an I? Is this an X? Is this an E? Is this a U? Like, what is this thing? And this was me the first time that I went to an ultrasound for our firstborn son, Judah, before he was born. We go to this ultrasound, my wife, me, her parents, my parents, and we're at the ultrasound, and everybody's looking at the same ultrasound, and I'm like, and they're like, oh my gosh, look at his cheek, and look at his little nose, and look at his eye, and I'm just like wanting to fit in. So I'm like, oh, look at his leg. And Nicole's like, that's not his leg, that's his spine. I'm like, okay. Because I didn't know what I was looking at. I never really looked at an ultrasound before, so I wasn't seasoned in this. But by the time we finished with him and we got to Elijah, our second child, I was a little bit more of a pro. So we went to look at the ultrasound, and I knew everything that I was looking at. I'm like, oh, okay, I see all of these things. And about 3 weeks ago or so, we went to do, man, it was longer than that, maybe 4 weeks. I don't know. Time flies. Elijah's two weeks old now. So, about 4 weeks ago, we go to look at his last ultrasound before he's born and everything, and we're looking at it, and Nicole goes, oh my gosh, he is so cute. Typical mom, I'm like, I'm more realistic, okay? And I said, babe, he looks like Quasimodo. Let's just be honest, okay? Because, and you can judge me, you're like, that's your son. Yes, I know, okay? But let's be honest for a second. Babies are not cute. And especially when they're like shoved in their mom's stomach and like their face is smushed up and it's like, all like fat and swollen and all this stuff and their nose is like this wide. I'm like, he's not cute. He looks like Quasimodo. He may be a cute Quasimodo, but he still looks like Quasimodo. Then babies are born and they look like a little bit better, but I mean, they're still a little swollen, stuff. But it's okay because then they're born and you're like, oh, wow, it's amazing. But anyways, I digress. I can only say that because my wife is still recovering from giving birth and she's not here to like give me the look. So some of y'all are giving me the look for her and I appreciate that, but not really. So we're looking at this ultrasound and I'm like, oh my gosh, I see it. I see his eyes. I see his nose. I see his cheek. I actually really do see his leg this time. I see all these things and I was able to pinpoint all this stuff. And I was so excited that I took a picture of the ultrasound and I sent it in a group text to some of our friends. And one of our friends hit right back and they were like, oh my gosh, he is adorable. I can't wait to hold him. Clearly this was a female. And then another person's like, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? And I'm kind of offended, right? Like, I know I said he looked like Quasimodo, but at least I said he looked like a person, right? And I didn't have to say, like, what am I looking at? But they said, what am I looking at? And so another friend, they screenshot it and they circled and they wrote what everything was, like the cheek and the eyes and all these things. And they sent it in the text and I'm like, yeah, that's what you're looking at. What you mean, what am I looking at? This is my boy. What are you talking about? But she said, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? Like, we sent it to her. You could see everything's right there. And she goes, what am I looking at? And a lot of times in our lives, God gives us an answer that is more than able to do everything we needed to do, but we're just looking at it and we go, what am I looking at? What am I looking at? God, I prayed for an answer. So what is this that I'm looking at right now? God, I prayed for a job. What is this? Don't look like no job to me. This don't look like the job I wanted for sure. I wanted to work at Chick-fil-A. I didn't want to be at Popeyes. God, like, what? We're looking. I guess you know what side of the argument I'm on. But we're looking. And it's like, God's like, here's the answer, right? You pray through, man. You're like, you got the prayer team on it, right? When they get involved, you know it's going to happen. And God gives the answer, and it's like, what am I looking at? Let me put my glasses on. Like, what am I looking at? God, this doesn't look like a financial breakthrough I needed. What am I looking at? God, this doesn't look like the healing in my marriage that I needed. What am I looking at? And so often in our lives, we end up full of overlooked potential. We're looking at something and we're like, what am I even looking at? And we're overlooking the potential. That's the first thing I need you to see today, is that a lot of our lives are full of overlooked potential. It says in verse 16, Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Jesus is like, they don't need to go anywhere. What you have in your hands is more than enough for the answer. What you have in your hands is more than enough. They don't need to go anywhere. Now, the truth is what was in their hands was not enough for the answer. But it had the potential to be multiplied into more than enough. And so often we're looking for the whole answer that we're overlooking the potential. We're looking for what God has for us. We're looking for the answer and we're ignoring the answer. We're so busy looking for all of these things, and God says the answer is right here. The disciples said, Jesus, you need to send them away because all we have in our hands is 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We don't have enough to be an answer. And Jesus said, what you have has the potential to be multiplied into more than enough. What you have can be multiplied. What you have is not just a little something, but it's the beginning of a great thing. And we're overlooking the potential of what God has because it doesn't look like what we thought it would look like. And he's given us the answer, and we're looking, and we're like, what am I looking at? Jesus told the disciples, he said, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. Stop looking for other people to bring the answer that God has given you the authority to give. Stop waiting for everybody else to do what God has already given you the authority to do. A lot of us are in our lives and we're waiting on somebody else. Waiting on somebody else. Just thinking somebody else can have the answer. That somebody else can do it. When God has given us the power to do it. We're waiting on a pastor. We're waiting on an evangelist to come through because, man, I've heard Pastor Dustin's messages for the last 6 months. Nothing's changed. When are we going to have an evangelist so somebody can come in here and I can get my breakthrough that I've been needing? When God's given you the power to change the thing you've been waiting to change. God's already given us the authority, but we're so busy waiting on somebody else to show up that we're not using what he already gave us. Waiting on somebody else to give the answer. And we'll look at it and we're like, you know what? I'm not qualified to meet that need. I don't have what it takes to meet that need. I'm not experienced enough to meet that need. Or simply put, if we're being totally honest, because it's the last Sunday at Rosebud Road, simply, I don't want to. I don't want to, God. Like, I need somebody else to come in here and do this for me because I don't want to do it. Blessed quietness. God, somebody's got to come in here and they got to fix this mess in my life because I don't feel like dealing with it myself. I need somebody to just lay hands on me. I'll fall out. I'll lay there for like 10 minutes and then I'm going to get back up and I'm going to be a brand new person. And God said, no. No. You give them something to eat. You have the authority already that Jesus has given you to bring about change. But so often we're just so busy waiting on somebody else to do it. Because isn't it easier to point the finger at somebody else? Talking about your index finger. Isn't it easier to point at somebody else and say, they need to do it? If you don't believe that's true, you've never asked for help at Walmart. Because you can go into Walmart, and you can say, hey, I have a question. And it's like, it's not my department. But you don't even know what my question is. It's not my department. Right? Because it's just easier to point somebody else and it be their responsibility. It's so much easier to be a spectator than it is to be a participator. It's so much easier to come to church on Sunday morning and sit and be a spectator than it is to be a participator in the service. I'm just being real. It's so much easier to be out and about and on your job and somebody's there and they tell you about an illness going on in their life and you're like, man, I will add you to the prayer chain at the church. Instead of just, you know what, God's given me the authority. Let me pray for you right now. It's so much easier to put the onus on everybody else. When God has given you the authority, he's given you the power to do what you've been waiting on somebody else to do. Waiting on everybody else. The disciples, they told Jesus, they said, hey, Jesus, we got a problem. The people are hungry, they're getting hangry, and we need somebody to give them food. We need to send them away so that we can get them food. Jesus is like, okay, you do it. They're hungry, they need food. You do it. God is telling somebody in this place today, you do it. You do it. Because whenever God lets you see a need, it's because he wants to use you to meet it. Whenever God gives you a burden of a need, it's because he wants to use you to meet it. And he's there and he's like, they're hungry. You got 5 loaves, 2 fish. You do it. You do it. And this is something that we struggle with in church a lot of times. Not just we, I'm talking about just in general. Capital C church, okay? Not just our church. Capital C church, we struggle with this because we think that everybody else needs to do something when God's given us the power. So we'll look at somebody and we can tell that they're struggling. In worship, they're just boo-hooing. And they're by themselves. And it's like, man, somebody should really go pray for them. Man, they need prayer. Hey, can somebody come over here? Can one of y'all come over here? Somebody needs to pray. Man, I really wish somebody would go pray for them. Am I the only one that sees this? Am I the only one that sees? Yeah, maybe. Maybe because Jesus is saying they may need somebody to pray for them. You do it. You do it. Find out somebody's in the hospital. Man, it'd be good if somebody went and visited them. It'd be good if somebody went and saw them. And he's like, you do it. You do it. See a need, like on the parking team at the new location. I'm going to bring this up every single Sunday until we have 50 people on the parking team. It's like, man, somebody should really sign up for the parking team to help be an MVP, to help tell people where to park and how to get direction and everything at the new place with the bigger parking lot. And he's like, you do it. You do it. They look at Jesus and they come to him with a need that Jesus has given them the power to be able to meet. Given them the ability to be able to meet. Don't keep waiting on somebody else to do what God has called you to do. Don't keep waiting on somebody else to do what God has been leading you to do, what he's laid on your heart to do. Because no one is anointed to do everything, but everyone is anointed to do something. And instead of being so focused on what you can't do, start doing what you can do. Instead of being so caught up in what you're not able to do and the things that you can't, you know what, you might be right, but do what you can do. Stop focusing about what you can't do. Stop giving all the excuses of why you can't do it and start doing the things that you can do. Because if you'll do what you can do and I'll do what I can do and they'll do what they can do, then we're unstoppable. The church is unstoppable. If everybody will do what God has gifted them and anointed them to do and stop trying to have the anointing of somebody else and start doing what God has gifted them to do and stop waiting for God to give them the opportunity to speak and start speaking into the lives of individuals one-on-one. Because some of us are just waiting for the big moment instead of being consistent in the little moments. If we'll all do what we can do, we're unstoppable. But the problem comes when we begin to think that what we have to offer is insignificant. The problem comes when we begin to think and look at what we have, and it's like, what am I even looking at, God? You told me I have this ability, but like this doesn't look, what am I looking at? That's when the problem comes. When we start discrediting ourselves and we're not willing to do anything because we're looking and we don't feel like it's good enough to get the job done. God says, just do what you can do. If you'll do your part, and I'll do my part, and they'll do their part, we're unstoppable. We're unstoppable. And let me say this too, by the way, that just because you have to put in work does not mean that it's not a miracle. Just because you got to put in some work does not mean that it's not a miracle. We're praying for a miracle. And Jesus gives an instruction, and we miss the miracle because we don't want to follow the instruction. Some of us are so busy waiting for a miracle and waiting for a miracle and waiting for a miracle that we're not following the instruction that God has given that will bring about the miracle. Just because it requires work, just because it requires effort, does not mean that it is not still a miracle. And I know that listen, how amazing would it be if you just prayed, and then tomorrow morning you woke up and every single person on your job that you don't like wasn't there anymore. They all got fired over the weekend. They all got fired. Wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be so much easier than you having to work on yourself and being willing to work with difficult people and seeing that maybe that person that you don't really like is not somebody that God's trying to remove from your life, but it's somebody that he wants you to minister to. It's somebody that he wants you to take a burden for. But it'd be so much easier if they were just gone. Wouldn't it be so much easier if you woke up tomorrow morning and there was $5 million in your bank account? I mean, at least he's honest. It's so much easier. So much easier. We're all like, no, I don't want that. I want to go to work. Yeah, right. You woke up and you looked at, you got an alert. There's a large deposit in your bank account. And you look, you're going to, I know y'all ain't in yet, but I won't be there. They call you back. How long you going to be out? Till Jesus comes. Be so much easier to just have it there instead of have to get up and go and to put in work and work your way up the ladder to get where God's promised you that you were going to end up. But some of us just want to jump there and we're ignoring the instruction. See, sometimes the miracle is in moving a little box. Sometimes the miracle is in calling somebody that you don't want to call. Sometimes the miracle is in putting in some work that you don't want to put in, but it's the instruction that God gave to get you to where he's trying to take you. Just because you got to put in work does not mean that it's not a miracle. Just because it takes some effort and some following of instructions doesn't mean it's not a miracle. And we're missing the miracles because we won't follow the instructions. We're missing the miracles because all we're looking for is a suddenly miracle, which what we got to realize is that more often than not, a suddenly is built off of consistency in the small things. We're so busy waiting and we're missing the miracle because we won't follow the instruction. Missing what God has because we won't follow the instruction. The disciples are like, you know what, Jesus? We would really love to help out. We would really love to do what you have for us, but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. This is all we have. We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus looks at them and he says, only is enough. Only is enough. That's the next thing I need you to see, is that only is enough. He said, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. See, what they counted as not enough, God viewed as more than enough. What they counted as it wasn't going to do anything, God said it's more than enough. Do not underestimate the power of only. Do not underestimate, well, God, I can only do this much, or I can only handle that, or I can only do that. God said, don't underestimate the power of only. Only one is still something. Only one is still something. You may feel like you can only do this much, but God says if you can do that, that's enough. Only 5 loaves of bread and only 2 fish was still something. And so often we're living in defeat when God has already won us the victory because we feel like we only have so little. We're overestimating the need and we're underestimating the power we've been given to overcome it. We're overestimating what we've got to do. We're overestimating how big the problem is, and we're underestimating what God has done in our lives. Do not underestimate the power that God has given you. We come in and we sing, great God, he's great God, all these things, but then we live our lives as if he's weak. We live our lives as if we can't do what God has empowered us to do. Why is it that our first response tends to be why we can't do what God's called us to do? Why is it that we always have to give our disqualifications? Why is it that we always have to tell people why we're not good enough? Or, hey, I'm sorry, I wish I could, but I can't. Why is it that when God gives an instruction, we say, God, I don't have what it takes to do that. You're going to have to use somebody else. Somebody else, God. You got a room full of people, somebody else. It's got to be somebody else. Oh, they need somebody to pray with them, God, somebody else. Somebody else. Anybody but me. Listen, my prayer life's not all that, God. I only pray for people when I want bad things to happen to them. Like, my prayer life is not all that, God. God's like, no. You've got what it takes. Do you realize that when you view yourself and you say, you know what? I'm not good enough. I don't have the potential. I'm not smart enough. I don't have what it takes. I'm not strong enough. That it's a direct reflection of how you view God. Every time you talk about how bad you are, It's a direct reflection of how you view God. Every time you talk about how you don't have what it takes, it's a direct reflection of how you view God. Because God is your creator. So when you view yourself as less than, you view him as less of a creator. When you view yourself as not good enough, you're saying, God, your creation is not good enough. When you view yourself as not smart enough, you're saying, God, your creation is not smart enough. When you view yourself as not strong enough, you're saying, God, your creation is not strong enough. We're praying for more than enough, but God is looking at how we're handling our just enough. We're praying for God to bring more than enough, God, overflow, abundance, all these things. But God says, how are you handling just enough? How are you handling the mundane? How are you handling the little things? How are you handling having just enough? God will bless you with more than enough when he sees he can trust you with just enough. God will bless you with more than enough when he sees that you're faithful with just enough. We're just waiting for the big thing, and we're not faithful in the little thing. We're waiting for the big moment, for our break, and we're not faithful in the little thing. Praying for more opportunities on our job. God says, what are you doing with the opportunities that you already have? Praying for God to do all these things. Praying for God to give more time. God, I need more time. It's like, what are you doing with the time that you have? Are you faithful in the time that you have? Praying for more finances. God's like, what are you doing with the finances that you have? It's easy to pray for more, but God says, are you stewarding well what you have? If you will steward well what you have, then God can bring what you don't. If you will steward well what you do have, God can actually bless you with what you don't have. And we're like, man, God, I need more. God, I need more. If I were to ask, and we were honest, I don't know, I don't know if it'd be totally honest, so I'll just raise my hand for myself. If I were to ask, though, how many people in here have asked God for more of something in the last year, I think every hand would go up if we were honest. Who's asked God for more? Every hand would go up. It's okay. I know Sunday morning, it's okay. He's talking about you. He's not talking about me. I saw you almost raise your hand, though. He got you. But if I were to ask, if we were honest, we would all probably say that we have asked for more. Because more would always be nice. More would always be good. Because we're praying for things, and God's given us something, and we're looking at it, and we're like, Well, what am I looking at, God? Like, I want filet mignon. This is like a cube steak. What am I looking at right now? God says, maybe the cube steak needs to be managed so that I know I can trust you with the filet mignon. We're like praying for all these big things, and God's giving little things. And he's like, how are you going to steward the little things? How are you going to steward your time? Are you going to be willing to serve? Are you going to be willing? Are you going to be willing to do things for me? Or are you going to just take all of your time and just wrap it up in yourself? How are you going to steward your finances? Are you going to give? Ooh, that's a tough word. Are you going to tithe? Come on, that's Jesus. Are you going to, or is it all just going to go? Is it all going to go to watching the Florida Gators win every single football game this year? That we already started last night. Come on, somebody. Are you going to steward well? Yeah, it's already started. Georgia ain't even played yet. Florida's better than them. Bam, roll tide. What? They 0-0. They don't have any wins this year. I ain't seen them win a football game. Stop living in the past. It's not 2018 anymore. Matter of fact, Alabama is 0-1 in 2019. Let me throw that out there for you. But it's like, sorry, let me get spiritual again. All right. But God's like, you're praying for abundance, right? You think you're going to wake up and your bank account just boop, popped. Just amazing. But how are you stewarding the little bit that I've already given you? Disciples, you're asking for more food, but you won't even give me the 5 loaves and 2 fish that I already have for you to multiply. You're holding on to it yourself. Jesus said, how are you going to steward what I've already given you? If you will steward well in the little things, then I can bless the big things. We're just, God, I need the big things. God, I need this. God, I need that. And some of us are stopping our more than enough by how we're handling our just enough. Just enough to get by. God, what am I looking at? I got just enough to get by. Just enough to get by. God says, you're stopping your more than enough by how you are handling your just enough. When you look at it and you feel like, oh, this is just enough, that lets you know God has more, but he wants to watch and see how you're using that. Jesus said, he said, listen, you have 5 loaves and 2 fish. I know you do. Give them to me. Give it up. Give it up so that it can be multiplied. Give it up so that it can be multiplied. As long as the disciples held on to it, it was 5 loaves and 2 fish. But the moment they gave it to Jesus, he multiplied it. So the last thing I need you to see is you got to give it up. Give it up. Verse 19, he directed the people to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. I'll close out with this. They had a little bit, just a little bit, and they gave it up to Jesus, and he multiplied it. Now, as long as they held on to it, as long as they held on, as long as we hold on to what we have to offer, as long as we hold on to what we understand and what we can do and what we can manage and what we can handle, as long as we hold on to that, then it's limited by who we are. As long as we hold on, man, I only have, I don't know how many hours are in a week, but I know that there's 24 in a day, so multiply that by 7. I only have this many hours. This many hours, that's all I have in the week. And God says, what are you doing with the hours that you have? I only have this much finance. God says, what are you doing with what you have? As long as you hold on to it, it is limited to who you are. So if it hasn't been enough, nothing's going to change. If it's not been enough, it's never going to be enough until you give it up to be multiplied. Jesus told the disciples, he said, give it up to me so that it can be multiplied. When we give it to the one who multiplies, then not enough becomes more than enough. When we give it up, when we take our understanding, it's like, God, I don't understand this. I don't understand. And we turn it over to him, our understanding is multiplied. Instead of trying to figure it all out on our own, have all the answers on our own, God says, I will multiply that thing in your life. But you have to be willing to give it up. Yes. Instead of just looking at it and complaining about, God, it's not enough. God, it's not enough. God, it's not enough. God, it's not going to happen. God, is not going to get me through. And we will take that thing and realize the potential in that thing and give it up to the one who can multiply. God can multiply in the way that only he can. You may feel like what you have is not enough, and on your own, you might be right. You might be right. What you have isn't enough to get things done. But if you will turn it over, if you will give it up, y'all can stand all over this place if you're able. If you will give it up to the one who can multiply, if what you have, your finances, your time, your energy, the things that you know, the things that you understand, if what you have is not enough, then what do you have to lose? What do you have to lose by giving it up to the one who can multiply it? What do you, if you've been looking at that thing, whatever it is in your life, I don't know. But if you've been looking, for me, I'll be honest, for me, it's been wisdom. God, I don't have the wisdom to handle everything that's going on. God, I don't have the wisdom to handle this. The church is moving, newborn infant, everything else at the church got to keep going. all these other things, small things. God, I don't have the wisdom to handle it all. And God says, if you will give it up, as long as I hold on to it myself, I'll never be smart enough. But God says, if you will give it up to me. Some of us, we've been holding on so tightly to our finances that we just won't give it up. Won't give it up. Because it's like, what am I looking at? I'm not looking at enough. Jesus says, if you will give it up, I'll multiply it. Some of us, we don't have peace. We don't have peace. We're looking at the peace in our lives and we're a wreck. No peace. Jesus says, if you will give it up to me, I will multiply it. Some of us, we feel like we don't have any hope. And we're holding on to a little thing that provides just a glimmer of hope for a moment. And we're protecting it and we're keeping it. And Jesus says, if you will give that thing up to me, I'll multiply your hope more than you could ever imagine.